We're really grateful that General Wheeler took time from what's an exceptionally busy schedule, as you know, to come back to CSIS, speak again on this topic. His full bio will be on the web. It's too long to read, or we wouldn't have enough time.
Not very exciting either, so.
Well, I don't know. So, okay, how many people in the room are also B-2 pilots? I don't know. Great career, and I'll read your title just in case people don't know it. Deputy Chief Information Officer for Command, Control, Communications, and Computers, and Information Infrastructure Capabilities at the Department of Defense, and one of the people who's really helped make the Spectrum process work in the last few years, so we're grateful you're here. Please.
Well, first off, it's my pleasure to be here. A couple comments up front. They don't have me set up for questions, but I understand there will be some questions, so I'm going to cut my comments short, if that's okay, and I'll dive into any subject that you would like to go into. I have no problems with it. I'm sitting there looking at Kate in the back, who wrote some of my comments in here because she's a lawyer to check to make sure that they're okay. So I've readied them all up, so this could be a very interesting discussion that we have here. Bottom line, we've had a very successful auction, and a couple comments I'm going to walk through today. What does Spectrum mean to the military? How do we have another successful auction? Because we're not done. There's absolutely no doubt that this isn't the last time we're going to go through this particular piece. I'll give you some thoughts on that particular area, and also how the team, I think, can play together better, if you will, because I really think that industry partnership and I'll say DoD from my perspective, but with government as a whole, is the way that we'll do business better in the future as a nation per se, if you will, as well as from a DoD side to make things happen. So the idea is to get stuff done, and it's a very complex world of government to these days if you haven't seen what's gone on in Washington in the last few years. So that part of it I do want to talk about, and I do welcome your questions in that area because I think that's how we get in the future. So I'm going to have a couple prepared comments, and then I'll walk right there. I made them shorter so that I would not take all the time. First, why I think it's differently and what is differently today. So first off, I appreciate the opportunity to come here, and I want to make a couple comments. We're in an era of rapidly evolving technology and new threats. The very metrics for taking stock of this change and are ever changing. For commercial users, we've seen the numbers that show skyrocketing consumer demand for mobile data. The last time I was here, I was showing specific pictures of where we were going in that particular area. The one that I love is the Cisco Virtual Networking Index that shows a 10-fold increase from 2014 to 2019. A 10-fold increase from 2014 to 2019. Those are big numbers. And that's not just about the commercial side, but it's also on the military side. So that is about what we do and how we do business in the military side, whether we're going into a typhoon-ravaged Philippines and saving lives, or whether we're in a combat situation. And if you look at what the military has done in the past 10 years, a lot of it has been in that latter part, in that Philippines-type scenario, whether it's Tomodachi in Japan, in those particular areas. That is also a big place where we use Spectrum at the same time. So as I said, at the same time, our nation's warfighting face a parallel revolution in escalating and increasing complex Spectrum requirements. Their demand curve for new and improved Spectrum accesses are also daunting. So while we see the commercial side moving up, we also see the same capabilities on the military side increasing at that same 10-fold or even more in some cases. And you would expect that because in many cases we're using off-the-shelf technology. For U.S. forces, the good news is that the lightning fast pace of technological advances, the vast majority of which depend on Spectrum, is improving our agility and our ability to innovate. And that's key. The objective here is deterrence. We're trying to deter not to have a combat situation. So the better we are, the better capable our forces are, the less chance in many cases there will be combat. The less good news for all of us is that both the state and non-state actors are increasingly also having easier and offer cheaper access and able to adapt much more quickly to these same capabilities. The national military strategy recognized that when applied to military systems, this diffusion of technology is challenging competitive advantages long held by the U.S., such as early warning and precision strike, which is a backbone of what we do in the military these days. As all of you sitting in here already know, Spectrum is finite. We always talk about that below 3 gigahertz type of area there, what we call the Spectrum beachfront property. That is finite. They're not going to make any more of that, so we have to have technology help us. Renewable resource and the frequency bands most suitable for most government and commercial operations today, I will say that. And they're already congested and contested. I'll use that several times, congested and contested at this particular point. This inescapable dilemma of physics and the complexity of today's warfighting environment compels DoD to transform old ways of thinking about spectrum use. And that's where we are going today and where we have in the past. This brings the department to where we are, and which is at the forefront of major changes ranging from geopolitical challenges. Right now we have the World Radio Conference going on, and we're working that right now in Geneva, trying to align the world up on how we do business. Because remember, not just from a military perspective, but also from a commercial perspective, if I go into that same typhoon-ravaged Philippines, I have to use commercial spectrum as well, and I don't want to go on top of somebody who's also trying to make life-saving type connections, if you will, in that particular arena. So there's a balance between the two, and that's what the World Radio Conference is all about. So I'm an operator. So forefront to me doesn't just mean embracing change in the room whose national spectrum policy is hammered out, but from the view in the seat of a cockpit. So here's my favorite part of this. It's called the Spectrum Freakonomics. It's a new way of thinking about spectrum management. Many of you may have remembered a book published about 10 years ago called Freakonomics, which attempted to apply the rigors of an economic point of view to everyday problems to come up with new ways of thinking about solution. The idea is that many people are too busy to rethink the way we think. An overriding theme was to upturn conventional wisdom about how to solve problems by changing the kind of questions that were applied to them in the first place. Freakonomics focuses on how the roots of problems can often best be addressed in looking at incentives from different directions. Because DoD's overriding incentive for spectrum management is the need to successfully accomplish our mission, my focus today is how these evolving mission requirements are driving new ways of thinking for DoD. This kind of shift is occurring in radio frequency management, or as we'll call it, freakonomics, that are congested and contested in today's spectrum bands. New threats and emerging technology capabilities all compel new ways of planning for, defending, and improving our spectrum access. We indeed need no greater incentive. We in DoD support and are a part of this mobile broadband revolution. When I say we support it, we're also, again, a part of it. We actually buy different products that you have and use them on a daily basis, whether it be a BlackBerry in this particular environment or whether we light up a battlefield with LTE. And I'm not sure if people fully understand that connection. It used to be we use these tools all the way to the edge of the battlefield. Well, now they're being used in the battlefield. So I think people need to understand that while we work it from a commercial side, we also buy those same tools, and there's opportunities across the board. And we are establishing through policy and leadership, technology, innovation, partnerships, developing and new testing and modeling simulation R&D initiatives. The nation-building aspect of telecommunications as an economic base has proven itself in Afghanistan and Iraq. However, the challenge is that different versions of this radio freakonomics dynamic are unfolding throughout the world. Now, one personal commercial mapping capability is also another precision targeting tool. The Internet of Things is poised to bring about even more events that will change this vein. One person's smart grid may be another's command and control tool for cyber warfare actions in an increasingly connected utility infrastructure. These are unprecedented change agents for all of us. A fundamental freakonomic type of spectrum problem is how to improve access to a finite resource on which the demands are seemingly limitless. Because DoD's end goal is operational flexibility, this means we are focused on how to transform spectrum limits into opportunities while we defend ourselves from risk and exploit the opportunities that advanced technologies bring. In order to do this, we must be more spectrally efficient and mission effective, and we must become more agile to use our own systems in these complex operational environments. These forces are to address operational constraints, balance national economics, objectives, and improve efficiency, adaptability, and agility for military spectrum-dependent systems. This is quite a different motivator for all of us. So today's spectrum realities. We are right now just finished having a spectrum auction. We ended up selling a significant port of a very important band of that. We are now in the transition phase of that particular piece. In other words, that money will now come to us and we'll transition as rapidly as possible with our industry partners to get us out of that particular band. At the same time, we're looking at an environment where we may have to plan for that next auction. That next auction is a very difficult arena for us to walk right into as we have just finished one and we're doing both at the same time. So I'm moving my systems. I'm moving approximately $3.5 billion worth of systems, whether that be on aircraft, on ships, if you will, on telemetry type systems, at the same time planning for a potential next auction out there. And understanding that's the needs of the nation, and that economic piece is just as important as what DoD does every day. So that's the environment we're in today. So let me talk a little bit about how we get into that next phase of this and do this particularly correct. Making a decision on the next particular way and how to get us working on that next set of potential auctions, there's really three parts to this. Three decisions are made out of this. First off, there's a financial piece to it. There's going to be a political aspect of this, and there's going to be a technology dimension of this particular area. So first off, the financial reality. There's a financial reality for industry, and that financial reality comes in the face of revenue coming in from various particular commercial type entities that are in there. For DoD, there's a revenue that will be necessary to move us out into comparable spectrum, or for us to use a new technology to make us more efficient or more capable. And I think there's a win-win there. And I think that's and that's a key point to what we're talking about here, that there needs to be that balance and that working together between industry, if you will, and Department of Defense, and basically the whole of government per se, to make that win-win situation, because I think there is a balance that can occur. That balance also allows us to jump into the next part, which is the technological piece. We've built a center out in Colorado Springs for the very idea of testing these particular pieces. We built into the spectrum legislation the ability to use part of that auction money to build new technologies to make us more agile, to make us more spectrally efficient. And that doesn't just go for DoD. That goes for industry as well. So we can use that same beachfront property in a more efficient and effective way for both DoD, the rest of the government, and industry, so we can do this better. So using that, if you will, that test bed that we have that sits out in Colorado called NASTIN, we're able to do more kinds of testing in this particular arena, test new technologies, and we're basing it on sound principles that everybody can agree to. Okay, we've agreed to this set of testing rules. We go ahead and test them, and when they come out, it's not a question of emotion. It's a question of these are the standards, these are the technologies that we tested, these are the results, here are the economics, and there's also going to be a political dimension. But I would argue that those political dimensions get minimized when industry, partnerships, and government work together, and we work through the technology side, and then we get into a point where now the technology side of it and the actual costing of it becomes the predominant piece, and the politics becomes the lesser piece. I've been given a little word from the back of my room there that we're coming close to that 5-minute time because we started a little bit early because of the traffic piece. I have some closing comments, but I'm going to open it up here for a couple of questions, and then I'll go from there. Please.
I'll speak at once. We got one here.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sir. Sal Dietrich with Federated Wireless. Can you comment on the economic value of spectrum sharing?
Okay.
You talked about agility and new technologies, but in the 3-5 AMR companies active, can you comment on perhaps even bidirectional sharing as a way to get more access to spectrum?
Sure, absolutely. So that was going to be one of my closing comments. So we look at bidirectional sharing. You look at the PCAST, all those reports that were out there, they talked about bidirectional sharing. It's a way to use finite pieces of spectrum more efficiently. But that goes both ways. So that's government using, if you will, industry spectrum, and industry using government spectrum. And we're working on a pilot program with several of the telecoms right now on that particular arena, and trying to make sure that we figure out what the right pieces of it are, what are the hurdles technologically and from a regulatory perspective. And I've had, 3 separate meetings in that particular arena, and we're right now working through some test beds in that particular area because we think there is opportunity in the future to do that even further. So the good news about that particular piece, you don't have to wait for an auction for those kind of pieces. It doesn't take the timelines that it does. It has economic benefits to industry very quickly. And in many cases where we're doing, if you will, any kind of an exercise, it has major economic benefits, for example, to DoD very quickly as well. So it's a way of teaming. It's a way of going back to that whole piece of relationships between industry and DoD can make or break the next auction, and or other ways of producing instant economic benefits to both groups in an environment today that has a less and less, open areas of spectrum below 3 gigahertz in particular. Does that help answer that question there? I think that's a very important way we go ahead. I really believe that's a way to do business very quickly, get things done, and have wins that can grow into larger wins as we move down the line, if that helps. Okay? What other questions do we have? Okay, please. I might get shot by industry if I did that, so I don't necessarily want to do it. But the idea behind it is we have a couple of areas of the country where We're struggling a little bit with large exercises to have enough spectrum. They also would like us to move out of some of the areas that we know they bought in the auction quicker as well. So there's areas where we can move out and give them the kind of spectrum that they need in an area to move out of an auction quicker so that they get quicker revenue per se, and then at the same time, this helps us do our exercises more capably and more efficient, if you will. So that's the kind of areas we're working that helps their revenue stream, especially in areas where they just bought auction piece, and then at the same time, there's an area probably close by or fairly close by that they have some spectrum that's presently not in use and it's typically in a smaller population area that I can use in that arena for my exercises. So that helps both of us. And it works pretty well as far as from a theoretical. We're actually going to try this in a couple of cases soon. We have one case we've actually done already, if that helps. Okay? Other questions? Please.
Contested. And can you just expand on what you mean by it's becoming more contested?
So I'll go in a couple arenas here, if you will. So you have licensed, unlicensed, and government all in the same line. And the unlicensed are building out in that particular arena. That can create an issue of who owns this, what's the right person to be in there, and there's different views on sometimes the regulatory piece to it. So it's contested in that environment. When you go overseas and we're working with other countries or different places, it's contested for a variety of reasons. Sometimes our bands don't match the other ones in the rest of the world. Our telecom band, for many cases in different parts of the world, do not in any manner, shape, or form represent the exact band that's in other countries. So there's a discussion in that particular arena. So I think there's multiple areas. Obviously, from a combat scenario, when we go in to a country, if we have to kick down the door, then in that particular case, it's contested in a different set of rules. But they're not that different than when we come into some place and we have different ruling bodies saying, hey, you can't use this, or you can, or they just turn it on and you jam you. If the transmitter's on, it's jamming you, whether it's a bad guy or somebody that believes they should be there and do it. So it's kind of a contested environment as it gets more compact. And there are technology solutions to it. And I think this is in no doubt, there's a lot of different parts of the regulatory piece that are coming together. I think this will be less of a problem in the future. I think as we go down to the future and we get the regulated, the unregulated, the government, if you want to call it such, all together, unlicensed and licensed, I meant to say, and government all together in the same piece in that, and we have a few more years under our belt, I think this will actually get better in that particular case, and we put some technology pieces in there. But we're in that arena now where we're moving out into new areas that we haven't had before, and there's going to be some rough edges. And there's some new technologies that appear to be very promising, but they have some issues that are associated with deploying, and during that deployment phase, we are going to have trouble. And I can give you a couple of areas, like just if you're doing geographical sharing. Let's talk about satellites. So part of the auction, how we got to nirvana of getting a deal out of this is we have to have geographical sharing in some cases because I can't change satellites on orbit. We put satellites up, phenomenal satellites made by U.S. manufacturers that lasted 20 and 25 years longer than expected. We actually used, that spectrum could come from the late 80s or the early 90s that we put satellites on orbit. We didn't have the abilities to have multiple transmitters or receivers up there at different frequencies. So those particular fixed locations are in the U.S. and they have to be there because of just the physics of the particular scenario. So how close you can allow encroachment by other systems? Can you put up kind of barriers? And there are actually physical barriers, and there's actually environmental barriers like trees. As funny as it sounds, trees at the right height are a very good environmental barrier. And getting those models right on the technology side was a big discussion between industry and DoD. We were more conservative in that because we were worried about satellite impact, and they thought we could do a little bit closer. We actually came to the middle with some good modeling, and we still don't have the final answer as to exactly how close we can get. So those are the kind of things I think will work out. I gave you a couple examples. Does that help in that particular arena? And so I hope that does. And the 3.5 and the 5, we're going to see some of those same problems. And so I think that's a very important point that we're going to see, because those are the next bands that have licensed, unlicensed, government, non-government entities all working. And in this case, they're off the coast because many of them are radars and ships and different things. It makes it a little bit more complex. That's all I'm saying, okay? There's a ways forward, okay, which is just going to take time, and it's going to take people that are willing to come to the table and work through the issues. And I think it can be a win-win for both sides, as we've done before. I'm looking in front here of a group of people that did this win-win with me before, and it worked. It didn't work like a champ. I almost said that. So that's probably not the truth. But it was pain. It was nugged out constantly. There was yelling at times at each other. But we came to a benefit of the nation as well as the government entities, and it balanced itself out. And I guess we'll see in the next few years if the next one goes as well. I hope we've left a path forward that allows us to think through these things and to do these correctly from both an industry perspective as well as from a government perspective, so we can work hand in hand as partners. And I think that's the way forward. I'll take one more. Please.
Fred Schwing from Boeing. This may be a little bit in the weeds, but one of the challenges we've been having are with direct commercial sales of military-type equipment to other nations. It's not an FMS case, and DoD handles that spectrum through the AIMS process. It's not an FAA issue, it becomes an FAA issue, but it's handled through the civilian processes that we use. But for military aircraft, derivatives, and things like Chinooks, it's an increasing problem that DoD says, yeah, we approved that sale of that equipment, but you have to handle that with the FAA and NTIA. But they say you need to handle that through the AIMS office, but we can't. So is there a chance of this is the kind of thing we work at the 06 level, and it doesn't get to the director very often. So this is an area we need some help on. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I can answer that. Okay, so honesty, when I leave this meeting, when I drive back, I have a telecon with the ops person from FAA as I drive back. So that's the next thing I'm doing on my schedule today, honestly, on this particular area. But you're walking into the DCS direct sales, if you will, versus FMS, which is foreign military sale case of that particular area. But you're also walking into other countries' spectrum and the way they do it. So each of the countries do it differently. And in some cases, it's controlled, as we've seen in the World Radio Conference, in very, very different manners in different parts of the world. But the FAA piece is a very important piece of that particular puzzle. So we're aligning ourselves more and more with FAA to help that. But I can talk to the international sales folks, because I know exactly who the person is that does those, in that particular case, the Chinook in there. And so what I'll do is I'll leave a card here. You can contact me, and I'll put you in touch with the right person. Is that a fair comment? Is that good? Does that help a lot? Okay. All right. I'm going to do one more, if you don't mind. Can I do one more, just for the case of it?
Sure, what the heck.
Okay. Go ahead. I saw the hand. That's why he was bouncing. Go ahead.
Sure. Do you think that military uses of spectrum get enough due in a big picture sense of, you can read any newspaper article these days and it talks about how we need more spectrum for wireless broadband, yada, yada, yada. And because the military uses are so complicated, it's easy to just say, well, they've got to do their tech stuff, but we don't really understand that. So all we understand is I want my phone to be faster. As someone who, that's very important to you, do people need to pay a little bit more attention to, what you would be doing with that spectrum?
Well, okay, to be selfish, I think we should always pay more attention to my spectrum. I'll leave it at that. But that's a factual point. But is that fair to the rest of the government? There was some of what you talked about, but at the table with the people, and I'm not kidding, I'm sitting here looking at them at the front table, that was taken into account in that particular area. The one that we use as a unique kind of piece was we always say, well, you don't use that spectrum very often. You only use that 5% of the time. And I go, thank God, because that's the missile launch per se for an inbound system. And you can't put somebody commercially on that, because if you do, and I don't get it the day I do it, that's just a bad day for America. And so I have that side to it too, and I have to explain examples and walk through that. Once you walk through that, people understand that it shouldn't be used 24/7, and we don't want that to happen. And so that's the other side to it. It just takes people sitting down and, this is how I use it, this is why I do what I do. Could I do better than this? Sure. Could I do better than this? Sure. The last piece, though, you bring into it. Some of our systems were not digital. They were obviously the old analog type systems. But we couldn't afford to upgrade them all because we've been in 10 years of counterterrorism type piece. We were focused on that. And when we start to come back home, we looked at this, we took a look at the auction, and we said, okay, we can get more agile, and we'll use some of the auction proceeds to help us, because the new equipment then will make us more actually efficient, and that's going to open up more for the future. So you get a double on that particular piece. So that's the good news of an auction. If it's done correctly, it can help you and it can help industry simultaneously. It just has to be worked through it, and it is a lot of individual line by line looking at each system and figuring out how to do that better, okay? It's just hard work. It really is, and it takes a lot of people willing to sit at the table, shake hands, and work through this and get through it and see both sides of the picture. Nothing more to say on that particular arena. I appreciate your patience with me, and I jumped around a little bit, but I needed to because we started a little bit late. So again, thank you for all your time, and I'll get off the stage.
Great, thank you. Could I ask the panelists to come on up now and we'll get started? Hopefully there won't be shouting with the panel. I'll introduce them briefly. Their full bios are on the website. It is like Old Home Week. And there are some seats in the front for those of you in the back if you're
gonna be in the middle?
No, you can be. I'll be at the end if that's okay. All right. So let me go through in no particular order. Peter Tenhula, an old friend, Deputy Associate Administrator. Oh gosh, you buy a new building and.
Here.
What was I saying? I was saying Peter Tenhula, Deputy Associate Administrator for Spectrum Management at NTIA. Longtime Spectrum veteran, 16 years at the FCC, experience in the private sector. Tom Power, now at CTIA, formerly Deputy Associate Senior Vice President at CTIA, Deputy Chief Technology Officer at OSTP prior to that, and senior positions at FCC in the private sector before that. Julia Snap, another old friend who's been here many times, and we're grateful for coming again. Chief Office of Engineering Technology, FCC. And it says here that you've been at the FCC for 38 years.
It's I'm starting to be like Jack Benny. I've been at for 38 years for 3 years. It's actually 41.
Well, that's even more astounding. So we appreciate your coming, and one of the real experts in the field. David Reddle, Chief Counsel, U.S. Subcommittee on Communications, House Committee on Energy and Commerce. Prior to the committee, he was at CTIA, Director of Regulatory Affairs, which is very important, and one of the leaders in the field here in helping cobble together some of these deals. With that, what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists if they could maybe take 4 or 5 minutes, make an opening statement, then we'll go to some interactive discussion, and you'll get a chance to ask questions. Peter, why don't we start with you? You ready?
Sure, okay. Sure. First, just, I know we left, but I do want to say a couple kind words about Jenna Wheeler, who was instrumental in the success of the AWS3 auction. And I don't know if it's been publicly announced widely, but he's leaving his post soon. But I wish him well and luck, and on behalf of NTIA, we couldn't have done it without him. You know, in the rooms, we were negotiating the spectrum policy. He was quite the maverick, but he didn't goose me too much. Oh, wait, he's a bomber pilot, not a fighter pilot, but he's still a top gun. But we'll miss General Wheeler, you know, in our meetings and conversations. I'm glad to see him here. But I can go into a little bit why the whole success was involved. I was involved in that, and how we can make it work better. But I just kind of want to maybe just talk about just a few general principles that NTIA is working on. NTIA, as Jim mentioned, I work for NTIA, which is the wireless administration. That's a joke about CTIA, the Wireless Association. But I will not try to out-joke Tom anymore. I'll leave it to him and just talk about a few principles that, you know, we're focusing on at NTIA. The first is that, you know, commercial wireless services, you know, obviously need more spectrum. We all recognize that. And so we're continuing to work towards that. And we're pleased to say that this year the halfway mark towards the 10-year plan. We're halfway there with, you know, nearly halfway. Once the FCC completes the incentive auction, we'll get over the halfway mark towards 500 megahertz, you know, by 2020. So, and then we've got 5 more years to get the rest of it done. And in doing so, we've recognized that this concept of sharing is required. We've seen it more recently in the 3.5 gigahertz band, but we're also seeing it when we're transitioning these bands, like General Wheeler talked about. Relocation of federal incumbents out of their bands, means that that's harder and harder to do. But then you say, well, where do they go, right? So you have to move them into other bands, and that means more Fed-to-Fed sharing. There's lots of Fed-to-Fed sharing already going on, but then you have to say, well, what about those feds that are impacted by the agencies that we're moving into their band? So one of the improvements in the recent legislation, I'm sure Dave will talk about, is the relaxation of the definition of eligible federal entity, which now allows other impacted agencies, like in those third or fourth domino bands, we call them, that incur costs as a result of that having to share with the other agencies or other systems, can now tap into that spectrum relocation fund. So that's a big development, and and promoting sharing, in that way, providing make sure all those costs are covered, both before and after the auction. The other notion that doesn't really need any real elaboration beyond what General Wheeler said, except that is that federal spectrum requirements are increasing at the same rate, if not more, than on the non-federal side, but it requires them to use the spectrum more efficiently and effectively. And of course, it's not just for the DoD systems. It's for those mission critical things like air traffic control. It's which it's nice to have our planes land safely. Law enforcement, video surveillance. Catching criminals. We like that, right? Fighting forest fires. So these are all kinds of making very accurate weather predictions. Finding our way to this building using GPS. That's a great kind of cool little thing. So those spectrum requirements, UAVs, all kinds of things, they're increasing as well. And this is all then driving the need for advanced technologies. And then to get there, and this is why it worked, why it's going to, we're going to have to do is it's all about trust and transparency, which are essential. And so we're focusing on, fostering and cultivating this culture of trust, and balancing the spectrum access needs, of various interests within the federal government, which is actually harder than I've realized than outside of the federal government. But it's those are, and then last but not least, and General Wheeler made this point as well, but I'll repeat it, is that it's all about collaboration, and that's what we're working on to. That's why it worked with regard to the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee working groups, the collaboration that went on there, the relationships that spawned, and then we're going to continue that going forward. It's within the government. We've had great relationships working on the Hill and within the administration and with FCC, and then industry, kind of rounds out that group. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you.
Good. Well, thanks. Just echo Peter's comments about General Wheeler. He's really been a key piece in helping us solve some really challenging problems, and just more broadly. These are really tough problems that we're working, and you need everybody to participate, and we've had a great group of people working together, from Capitol Hill on down at the agencies, and that's the only way that we can get through it, is through that kind of collaboration and trust. So General Wheeler mentioned a bit about the demand for spectrum. I'm not going to throw out a lot of statistics. I'm just going to point to two things that I think are telling. There's a great car commercial that's on right now, where they've got folks in and they say they're doing market research. And they collect the phones, they throw them in a chipper and tell them they've destroyed their phones, and they sit there in horror. What are they going to do if they don't have the phones? And it turns out it's a car commercial for connectivity of Wi-Fi. And who would have thought Wi-Fi in cars? So it's just indicative of how much wireless is growing. And then secondly, you walk into your favorite home improvement store, and now you're seeing displays. We've talked for years about the Internet of Things, and it's kind of abstract. We've pointed to individual things. Sitting there in a display is probably 20, 25 products. Many of them are innovative things, including things like moisture sensors And you've all heard stories about people going off on vacation, they come home, there's a flood in the basement. And they couldn't do anything about it. Well, now you can remotely have a water shutoff valve. Open your front lock remotely, et cetera, et cetera. So and we're really just at the start. So the demand is going to keep growing, and we're going to keep seeing those kinds of innovations. I'm only going to talk about two things in the area of spectrum management that I think really have been changing over time. We can't keep doing things the same way we've been doing for years, identifying one lightly used band, having the debate about whether it can just be repurposed and moved someplace else. There may still be some opportunities for that, but I think they're fewer and further between. We're going to continue to have auctions. We're going to continue to look for spectrum that can be reallocated. The brand new concept that we're working on and is going to be implemented next year will be an incentive auction in TV bands. And the whole idea is to fundamentally allow the market to drive transitions in spectrum through voluntarily turning in spectrum for the incumbents and making it available through reorganization of that spectrum for new services. So we're working really hard at the Commission to make that happen. Then I'd also just talk about the evolution of sharing, where we've gone from, there's been sharing probably since the beginning of spectrum management, but it was what I call static, in other words, to geographic separation, frequency coordination, and so forth. Over the last 15, 20 years or so, it's been getting a bit more sophisticated. In unlicensed at 5 gigahertz, we do what I would describe loosely as listening for radars, dynamic frequency selection. So you started to see in a few places sharing techniques that were based on a form of listening, whether it was listening just for signal level or listening in a smart way to detect what was there. Then when we moved on to the unlicensed white spaces, which is still in its very early stages, the idea there was, at first started out, well, we can figure out whether a spectrum is unused just by listening. Turned out to be a little bit more complicated. It's an important part of the equation, but we introduced the idea of using databases to tell us where the services are that have to be protected. The device checks the database, moves to the spectrum that is available, and so we can get more efficient use out of that. PCAST report that General Wheeler referred to basically said, well, let's take that concept a step further, something more sophisticated, and that's what we've adopted rules for at 3.5. First time ever where we've taken basically all of the players in one place, protections of incumbents, including the military use, a dynamic sharing between what you might think of as licensed and unlicensed, so that it will be driven by where the market goes. And part of it will also be auctioned as well. So it is very sophisticated. There's an industry multi-stakeholder group that's trying to work through a lot of the details to make this happen. And it's complicated, but it will get there. And I'll just say that these kinds of techniques are tools that we are looking at to try to solve some of the difficult sharing problems we have, for example, at 5 gigahertz, where we're trying to make more spectrum available for unlicensed. I think when you look at it, you say, gee, what's so hard about it? The systems that are there are either far more prolific or far more difficult to do things like detect, or they're designed not to be detected, and you've got to work around them. So we're continuing to evolve along this path. I completely agree with Chief General Wheeler's comment that there are going to be bumps, but we should be bold. And in a smart way, that we try to anticipate everything. You go in anticipating the problems and how you're going to deal with them, but by the same time, there are going to be things that happen, and you learn and you adjust, and that's a healthy process. So I'll stop there. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Just to continue our collective esteem for General Wheeler, I will also double down on how fantastic it was to work with him and his team at DoD on the AWS-3 process. We literally could not have gotten to where we got. I mean, a $44 billion auction is beyond what any of us imagined was possible, and it really is due in no small part to General Wheeler and his team. So I will echo the sentiment that everyone on this stage has had, which is that we will, if when he's no longer in that post, we will certainly miss him. And I'm same as Julie. I will not elaborate on the sort of demand curve for wireless. I think we all know what it is, and let's be honest, you guys do the definitive study on that, so you can feel free to chat about the good work of CTIA on the semi-annual survey. But what I do want to talk about is sort of the Capitol Hill process and how my boss, Chairman Fred Upton, has looked at this. And I think it's important to bear in mind that for Fred, it's been a more than decade-long process for us to get where we are today. Of the 5 major spectrum auction pieces of legislation that have been signed into law, all of them are on fiscal vehicles, and 3 of them were when Chairman Upton was involved. The 2005 DRA, which was the DTV transition, Fred was the chairman of the subcommittee at the time, and that really started sort of his push towards finding ways to be more efficient, right? That was moving the broadcasters from analog to digital, getting a dividend that ultimately produced an auction that, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but auction 73 I think was $17 billion in revenue, $17 billion in revenue, and more importantly, produced the spectrum that was the first commercial LTE band in America. So in a very real way, that work in 2005 has led us to where we are today with the ubiquity of LTE networks. That in and of itself was an achievement that any legislator should feel comfortable being a legacy for themselves, but that wasn't the end of it. Under Chairman Upton's chairmanship of the full committee, we've done 2 pieces of legislation that move the ball forward on trying to find ways to take lessons learned over the last 10 years and apply them to the modern spectral environment. The 2012 Middle Class Tax Relief Act, as Julie mentioned, was when we took another look at the TV band and said maybe we can apply the incentive auction concept here. And we are all waiting anxiously to see how successful that is next year, when the FCC gets to moving forward on getting the auction started. We are really anxious to see what the wireless industry does with that spectrum when they come to the table and buy those licenses and bring it to bear on our nation's challenges. But also part of that, and this goes to what General Wheeler was talking about, is the changes that we made to the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act. And having learned some pretty important lessons in the AWS-1 process in the late 2000s, there were some concrete steps we could take to say, okay, we saw that when we looked at how to transition government incumbents into a new band, to move them from one to the other, the law was hindering their ability to upgrade their systems. And in fact, at one point, there was a debate about whether or not there would have to be a commissioning of a company to produce some analog cellular equipment that was long since out of date, simply because the law may have required it. I'm proud to say that my boss took a lead in that, and Chairman Walden on the subcommittee also took a lead on that and moved forward with CSEA changes that allow systems to be upgraded as part of that process. Fast forward to a couple weeks ago, the Bipartisan Budget Act. We had good conversations throughout AWS-3 with all of the folks at this table, on this dais, and with General Wheeler about the challenges that were faced, as Peter said, in the domino problem, in that you could only spend money on the agency that was actually moving, but as it turns out, if you're trying to move from one band to another, and there's already another government agency there, you need to do some spending to make them work together, to fit together. We made those changes in the Budget Act that was passed a few weeks ago. God, was it only a week ago?
It was.
It was a week ago. It seems like a few weeks ago. A week ago. We also made pretty significant changes, and this was one of the other challenges that we know that government incumbents faced in this process, which was the way that the Spectrum Relocation Fund, which is the fund that takes a percentage of auction proceeds and is used to move the incumbents, is only usable for bands that have already been identified for auction. So the problem we had there was you had this sort of vast gray area. You had spectrum bands that were identified for auction and were going to move forward. You had ones that we're really sure we're probably not going to be able to bring to auction. And there's some of those too. And in the middle, this vast gray area of spectrum where it's like, well, you know, if the right technologies are brought to bear, if we're able to do some testing and do some research, we might be able to find a way to do sharing, either geographic or spectral, in those bands and bring some of that to bear on the commercial industry's challenges as well. So the Budget Act brought $500 million plus an ongoing 10% of proceeds to the SRF to bear on that challenge. And so we're really excited to see what DoD and others can do when they've given the money to say, go make yourself more efficient, go get our government users, whether they be military or otherwise, the best equipment you can and do the most you can with the spectrum you've got. That's the state as of last week. I'm happy to say that in the interim, in the last week, I know Chairman Thune in the Senate, I saw he had said that they are interested in continuing to work on spectrum. I know Chairman Upton is very interested in continuing to work on spectrum, and our Democratic counterparts have expressed that they are very interested in continuing to work on spectrum. So don't expect House Energy and Commerce to slow down on finding ways to continue moving this ball forward, getting us more efficient, getting our government users where they need to be, and making sure we have enough spectrum for commercial.
Great. Thanks, Jim. I'm very happy to be here, and I mean that literally because I almost walked into the wrong conference. This being Washington, you know, these things are going on all over town, and I was a block away, and I was just sort of lost in thought, and this guy on the street said, "Are you here for the conference?" And I said, "Yes," and he handed me a newsletter, and it said, Dental Registry News. And I thought, you know, people have equated reallocating spectrum to pulling teeth, but
there's so many jokes in that one. We can just number them.
I thought you had gotten a little cheeky with the newsletter or something. But thank you for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be with my colleagues and friends up here. And I, of course, share their sentiments about General Wheeler. He really accomplished wonders over there. And I know we're all impressed with him because we see all he did at DoD with both preserving the systems and the protection of the important systems that DoD operates, at the same time promoting an economic agenda that is as bipartisan as things get in this town. But as Jim Lewis said, you know, he's also flying B-2s, and at one point was responsible for managing all the nuclear materials in the country. That guy has done more in his career than I could do in 20 lifetimes. He's a real superstar here, and we will miss him. But I'm hoping he will be around in some capacity, still working with us. It is great to be able to work with folks like him and folks like this, and this is such a great area to work in. Even if you go back to the depths of the recession, this was an industry, the licensed wireless industry is an industry that was adding net jobs. And since then, the story has just gotten better. $400 billion in direct spending on licensed services every year, $30 billion in CapEx by licensed carriers every year. The economists say that every job in the licensed industry creates 6.5 more jobs throughout the economy. These are all great things, and it makes it an exciting area to work in. And Julie was mentioning some of the IoT developments that we see every day popping up, but those things were not inevitable. They were the result of good spectrum policy in the past, and equally important, faith in good spectrum policy going forward, and faith in folks like this to make that happen, and folks like General Wheeler and Commissioner Rosenworcel, who we'll hear from later. That's really what we're betting on in those investments, because investments are by definition an investment in the future. David recited all the great work that he and his boss up on the Hill have been doing over the last few years. You can start wherever you want. For me, I remember the FCC and the National Broadband Plan. There were a couple memoranda out of the White House, but of course it almost always is up to Congress. Congress is the one that steps up and makes these things happen. And David talked about the 2012 Act, which gave us the AWS-3 auction, the biggest auction ever, set the stage for the incentive auction. And now we have the last week's budget bill with another 30 megahertz to be auctioned, and setting the stage for another 100 after that, as well as the changes to the Spectrum Relocation Fund, which are really important. That's all great stuff, and we just have to stay at it. I think the collaboration that folks have talked about is really an important part of it. Some of this stuff is sort of strategic, and these changes to the Spectrum Relocation Fund are things that have to be thought through and make a big difference. But a lot of it is just in the trenches and working through this stuff. At NTIA and Commerce, there's the advisory committee that works on sharing of information and sharing of strategies between the private sector and the government. That has to continue, and we have to keep improving on that. I think about last year in the run-up to the AWS-3 auction, Congress passes the law, but it's folks like David who pulled folks together up on the Hill to say, how are we doing? How can I help? Either with support or kicking you in the rear, but we're going to make this happen. It's that kind of in the weeds work that needs to continue. There are lots of challenges, as Julie said, and we can talk about them more as we go forward, but it's a great area. We've got a great momentum going, and we just need to keep it going.
Let me start with the first question, and I'm going to pick something that's a topic that we're doing a little work on. And I think most of the speakers have mentioned it. It is kind of a buzzword, but it's the Internet of Things. So how's that going to, we know it's changing how the Internet works, because most of the things that connect to the Internet now are not people. And most of the things that are going to use spectrum independently will not be people in the future. And the car example is a good one, because there's been real battles. Battles isn't the right word. Real discussion over how do you manage the wireless connectivity of cars. And I was going to use the word unlicensed, but maybe I'll save that for a later question. But why don't we start with, how do you think the Internet of Things will change how we manage spectrum? When I started thinking about this stuff, I did not think about Internet of Things. I don't know about you guys, but go ahead.
For me, I just started at the highest level. It's, if nothing else, we know it's just demand is just going to keep going up.
Yeah.
Different folks have different estimates on that. General Wheeler cited, I think, the Cisco study that said it'll be 10 times demand in the next 5 years. We won't really know until we see it. Although I will say that estimates in the past, particularly the FCC's estimates back from 2010, proved to be pretty accurate in terms of the demand. I think the market and innovators will drive a lot of the details of this. I think for us, the most important thing is to keep in mind that it's gonna really, demand is gonna continue to be like that hockey stick. And as long as we're making the spectrum available, I think the innovators and the smart folks, engineers and people like that, responding to consumer demand will figure out the details.
So I guess I tend to lump it all together, and here's why. It really has emerged, I think, as part of the success story from flexibility. It's neither licensed nor unlicensed. And in fact, when you put the two together, it's more powerful.
Yep.
So some of the things that I rattled off are, they operate for their first connectivity through unlicensed space, maybe on your home Wi-Fi network, maybe Bluetooth and so forth. Then they connect, it can be wired or wireless, to allow you to have access to them in a different place. So I don't think IoT is band specific, because the blend we're seeing is all over the map. The innovators decide where the right match is for what they want to do with the spectrum that's available. But in the end, spectrum has to be available, no matter whether we're talking licensed or unlicensed in the application. And I will just finally say that some of these just go blip every now and then. So the fact that they're there doesn't mean that they're necessarily consuming a lot of spectrum. Others, you put a camera on and it's on constantly and doing HD or 4K now, and that's going to consume a lot of spectrum. So I think there's going to be a mix of things, and I think the story is yet to be told as to how big an impact it is. We're going to see a lot of devices. We just know we have to have space for that innovation to occur.
And you, Julie, hit on at the end exactly what I was going to say, which is I think you can divide the Internet of Things stuff into sort of two different categories, right? You've got the category that continues to be interactive, right? That's a challenge the wireless industry knows well. But whether they're licensed or unlicensed, we all know that they have taken the assets they have and they've managed to make the most of them, and they continue to do so. That's just the demand, as Tom said. That's just exacerbating demand and figuring out how to compete with it. Where I think it's going to be really interesting are the devices that aren't interactive, where there's some really interesting potential for creative scheduling. There's some really interesting potential for caching data and using it at better times. There's some really interesting business models that could come out of this. I think that's the really exciting part of IoT, to see how that works out and how we can apply that to the larger wireless ecosystem.
And I think that I always thought it was one of those Washington buzzwords until, and it's like, oh yes, it's one of those other drivers of demand for spectrum. But like Julie's and all these guys are saying, is that it really feeds into the whole spectrum ecosystem that has kind of built up over the decades from the ranges of rights. A thing, cannot call up the carrier to complain that my call dropped. That's one benefit, right? So the service quality may be a little, different depending on the importance of that thing, right? But there are very important things, and they've been around for a long time, like sensors, that monitor rivers for floods, and that monitor all kinds of things, that shoot up their data to satellites that NOAA runs, and then that shoot back down to all kinds of other places on Earth. And those are all being part of the broader network. So these data collection devices, are important. They got to make sure that they have the pipes and the pipeline, to get their data to where they need to go.
And I just want to echo Julie's point on flexibility, which means a lot of different things, but it's licensed, it's unlicensed. The licensed industry relies as much on unlicensed as licensed. We want that to continue to be a flexible band that continues to be the sandbox for innovation. Flexibility also means what bands are we looking at, because it's low band, it's medium band, it's high band, and the commission has just kicked off a rulemaking to look at the high band stuff. The different spectrum has different propagation characteristics, making it more or less useful for different applications and services. It's all got to be on the table to really be successful.
I was talking to a car company, and they were explaining how in one of the next generation of cars, the car will be able to see around the corner. Well, I said, that's really cool. It's hard to see around the corner. How do you do it? Well, the car doesn't actually see around the corner. Around the corner, there will be, and there's already some pilot programs, some embedded sensor that will be putting out a wireless signal that connects with the car before it gets to the kernel, before it does the turn, before it's in visual range, and says, hey, you've got an obstacle, or hey, you should slow down. So there's going to be a lot more demand. And when you think about smart cities, how are you factoring that? Another buzzword, sorry, we are a think tank, we have to use buzzwords. What do you think about smart cities? How will this fit in? Are you taking that into account? Or do you think the normal processes we have now will be good enough for allocating on what's a very different and broader set of customers and users for Spectrum? I think we're looking at you, Peter.
Are we? Sorry, I can't see around the corner. There's all kinds of applications, and the one initiative that's related to the smart cities is something that came out of the PCAST report called a test city or a model city, that came out of the President's Council for something. The smart people made recommendations regarding federal spectrum, and I said, so we're looking at the smart city initiatives and the needs of metropolitan areas for all kinds of applications, managing their transit system to the trash collection and all that. Emergency services obviously is a big one. How can spectrum sharing kind of fit within those initiatives? And where can you kind of have real life test beds in these smart cities so that the spectrum backbone that needs to support them can then be used for all these really cool applications. Smart vehicles is one of those, and we're working on a particular band with the Department of Transportation and the FCC, to make sure Wi-Fi and the Intelligent Transportation Communications can work together. So all of this kind of fits together. So what are those whiz-bang applications, in that environment? Because the city is a really crazy electromagnetic spectrum environment. That buildings, urban canyons, stuff like that. So the band you pick is important. The network you're on is important. So we're looking forward to the next step in this. We call it the model city concept that Julie and NTIA are working on together.
Yeah, I'd just say, sometimes the lines blur between what's IoT and what's smart city and so forth. What is it when you manage a traffic light controller to manage the flow of traffic or to control, the flow of water in the city and so forth? I know all those things are being looked at, and I think it's part of the equation. I'll just build on a little bit of what Peter said. The notion that came out of the PCAST is that you can model sharing analytically, then you can put it on a lab test bench. Maybe you take it in the backfield of the lab. But the proof of the pudding is in trying to get these things out there and deployed at some scale and see if they work the way you expect. And I think sometimes what happens now is we spend a lot of time on the analytical end and the debate, and before we get to a point of saying, well, let's just get out there and try this. And so one of the things that we're working on is how do we create And we've made some changes with our experimental rules to facilitate this. But how do we create places without disrupting existing systems where some of these concepts can be deployed at scale and tried?
So one of the friction points when we started this discussion, probably almost a decade ago, one of the areas where people might have concerns was the Spectrum Relocation Fund. And I know, and private agencies would often tell you that it wouldn't work and it was bad and there were going to be problems and so on. And yet it seems to be working okay. Do you think it's working okay? Where do we need to think about maybe improving it, or is it good as it is? So do you want to maybe just go on the panel and talk about Spectrum Relocation Fund?
I think it's working okay, and I think we got some good improvements last week.
Yeah.
This flexibility, David outlined the challenges where in the past the law was written so stringently that the money had to be tied to the particular band that was being auctioned and the agency that was freeing up the spectrum. So that flexibility is I think very welcome. The next step that has been sort of proposed is incentive auctions for agencies, basically. And Matsui Guthrie bill, the Congress folks who introduced that, we're looking at the possibility of you take a percentage of an auction and allocate it back to the agency, but not just for the cost of the relocation, but for a broader use, which, if you're the secretary or the CFO of the agency and you're looking at the possibility of taking funds from a spectrum auction and being able to spend it on tanks or dams or whatever else the agency's mission is that's not spectrum related, that creates even greater flexibility. And if you think about it in the private sector, the CEO or the board of a company can move money from marketing to sales if they want. It's that kind of flexibility to be given to agencies, which I think is a useful thing to think about. It's very challenging in the federal space, though, as Peter was saying. There's a lot of sharing between agencies, and so that approach might be the perfect answer for one agency, but if that agency is only one of 5 agencies that's sitting in the spectrum band, you got to solve it for the other 4 as well. So that's the kind of complications that arise on the federal side. But it is great to see folks on the Hill and through the agencies thinking about these issues and coming up with solutions. Because from the industry side, we want to work with the agencies. We want to help them solve their problems as they help us solve our problems.
Maybe before we move down the row, and since Tom used to live at the White House, and I'll put him a little bit on the spot, but in previous incarnations, one of the difficulties, or I keep saying difficulties, one of the issues with the relocation fund was the role of OMB. So has that gotten better? Has that improved? You can always say, I don't recall. But, I don't recall.
My work with OMB was great. Really thoughtful folks over there. They have a really important role to play. Like all of us, credibility is important, and their credibility rests on being good stewards of the funds. So I think anybody who's worked in any other federal agency would admit to some frustrations at times working with OMB, but I think they have been doing a great job, and the Spectrum folks there, in particular, that I got to work with, were completely on board with what the mission was.
Great. David?
From our perspective, we sort of look at the SRF as a toolbox, and it started off as a very good tool for a very specific purpose. If all you have are straight head screws, all you need is a straight head screwdriver. But as it turns out, there are circumstances that are significantly more complicated, and you're going to need a Phillips head and some Allen wrenches and a bunch of others. As we've started to go through the process from the SRF's beginnings to where we saw the changes that occurred just last week, it's been the recognition that there are very specific circumstances where very specific tools would be helpful. And Congress has undertaken to provide those tools where we see that there's a defined need to provide those tools and a defined benefit to the economy at the end of the day, to spectrum use. That's the way we've approached it over the last 5 years of Chairman Upton's chairmanship. And I think, having added the things in that we've seen with, as you mentioned, Guthrie Matsui pending, we see that as another tool that can be added to the toolkit for those agencies that can take a look at their usage and say, it won't be fun, but we can go off the air with this system we can move to a wired system here, you know, and I think that's an important aspect for us to keep remembering. Just because you can do it wirelessly doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. And I think we've gotten some systems out there where, yes, they're done wirelessly now, but we could move them to wired systems because technology has changed since their implementation. And so we're looking at each of these situations and saying, what can we do on the CSEA side as the Committee of Jurisdiction over the CSEA, and how do we make changes to that to give OMB and NTIA and the individual agencies the tools they need to get themselves more efficient.
And it's worth pointing out that OMB sent the letter up to Senators Udall and Moran earlier this year that showed their innovative thinking and their flexibility and their acknowledgement of the need for more flexibility in the SRF.
So I'll just make a couple of quick comments, because I get to sit when the discussions in the policy and plan steering group are about the money. I'm just an observer. But you know, sometimes the details are important, because you've got people who are with their agencies doing a lot of work, sometimes with supportive contractors, to try to figure out how all this is going to work. And like anybody, any contractor said, when am I going to get paid? And so I think the improvements that have been made in legislation are very much appreciated, and I think will make the process a lot better. And then the other thing that I think David alluded to is you sit with the agencies and they'll say, you know, I think I could make 50 megahertz or fill in the blank available if I could change my system, whether it's go to what, but I'm not sure it's going to work. And so I think some of the changes that have been made with the right safeguards create potential opportunities, I think, to free up more spectrum that with tools we didn't have before.
Yeah, the way the SRF and the Spectrum Relocation Fund has evolved so quickly over the years. I mean, this thing's actually really started, if you go back to the history of it, in 1998, in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year '99, which is named after Strom Thurmond. It was a negotiate the relocation approach. Basically, the auction winners were required to negotiate with the agencies, the incumbent agencies, to relocate, which was based on an FCC approach, for clearing the fixed microwave bands. That approach wasn't even tried. It was replaced in 2004 by the Spectrum Relocation Fund approach. And then that was applied in the AWS 1 band that David talked about. But the way that we've been able, and I would say that was overall a success, little bumps here and there, but the lessons learned from that, for example, the development of a Department of Defense portal for coordination. That, again, that was one of those practices that came out of AWS 1 that were being applied now. But it's all being paid, with SRF money. And now, with the new approach that came out of the 2012 Act, provided for these transition plans and the technical panel review and these really tight timelines, and especially, because of the way the other spectrum was lined up for auction in that act, you had to have those tight timelines. But what we learned, the main lesson learned there, was how crucial the planning was. And this is why the last week legislation, we're getting shorter and shorter between these improvements and and applying these lessons learned, provides this massive amount, of planning funds and plenty of time, to work with it and so I think it's really evolving very nicely. And there's a few other pending ideas these guys have talked about as well that would only improve the situation. Like I said, but it also relies on the people and stuff like that. And I would echo Tom's points about the colleagues at OMB. We work very well together. It's a partnership between NTIA and OMB in managing the SRF. Met this here from OMB and out in the audience, making sure I don't screw anything up. And but it's a great program. I mean, it's a huge, great government success program, and it's only getting better, with time. And right now it's flush. So let's see if we, the best part about it is being able to reinvest those auction proceeds into new and innovative communication systems for the feds.
I have loads of questions, but I don't want to hog the thing here. Do we have any questions right now in the audience? Good, if you could stand up and introduce yourself and wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Charlie Hotzoff from Rockwell Collins. So we have a very dynamic industry out there, yet the sale of spectrum is permanent. So has there been dialogue with a long-term lease so you can reassess spectrum after 10, 20 years and perhaps do that better versus selling it off permanently?
I guess I can start, I suppose. That hasn't been something we've looked at. I think if you look at the value that we have gotten in our national economy out of what the renewal expectancy is, right? Essentially that once you get the license, as long as you meet the terms of the license, you have an expectation that you'll be able to keep it. That's really promoted so much investment in wireless infrastructure in this country that we are the envy in a lot of ways of the rest of the world. I took a meeting recently with some folks who were coming in from another country who I won't name because that wouldn't be very polite, but essentially said to us, we don't understand why you don't re-auction the asset every 10 years. And we said, because we wouldn't see the level of investment that we see now if we continue to re-auction it every 10 years. At least in the flexible use commercial bands. It's not something that we've looked at. It's really a very uniquely American success story that we auction with these essentially long terms and such flexible use rights that you have an incentive to keep putting new technology on the towers every time we turn over a new air interface. We really are unique around the world in that respect. There are others that are doing it on a smaller scale, but on the scale that the United States does it, we really are unique around the world.
And I think you get the best of both, as David says, because you get that initial investment and you get maximum investment because of the certainty, but you also get the flexibility of the use of the license, which then means you're not stuck in some static world. The innovation can continue under that license.
I would just remind people that there's flexibility in the licenses as well.
Yeah.
You know, and it allows for secondary market use, and there's transactions that can go on. So even though, and the license actually in most cases have a term, and although there is a presumption of renewal. So there's a lot of flexibility, I think, in the long-term transition of spectrum driven by the market.
I'd also be, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this is something we tried to solve in 2012, right? Essentially that licenses go on forever. Broadcasting was that space, right? The broadcasters are broadcasters and they're going to be broadcasters forever. Well, we're going to see how that plays out next year. Are there broadcasters that think, I don't really want to be a broadcaster anymore? I'm happy to take the payout for my spectrum license and that spectrum can be put to better use. The market will decide whether or not that's the case. And I think that's really what's been the driving force for us is the market dynamic. In the flexible use wireless spectrum, it's been the dynamic of promoting investment. And in the incentive auction, it's the incentive of promoting the highest use. And so I think we've got the tools to keep moving forward with the policies that we have on, as Julie noted, flexible licensing. I believe 3550 to 3650 is 5-year licensing, correct? 3?
Right.
5? And we've got some licenses that vary from the sort of traditional 10-year that we have on the books.
Yeah, I think if you look 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of discussion of alternate models for allocating spectrum that would bring more market forces, more economic forces in, and make the system more flexible. And none of the models that we put forward, the people put forward, ended up being the one adopted. It's sort of a blend, but it seems to work pretty well. I mean, if you think about the dire concerns we had maybe 10 years ago about spectrum shortages and shortfall, it hasn't happened, and it is sort of a close-run thing. These guys up here have all made it work in some ways, but it's worked every time. So it'd be hard-pressed to describe how it works. Maybe you could do better, but it does seem to be working. Other questions? Please in the back there, and if you could identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
Yes, my name is Mike Champness. I've been supporting the Air Force for a while on trying to make available spectrum currently used by Homeland Air Defense, Homeland Air Security, working with other agency partners. And so I have sort of two questions. The first is, I recognize from the budget bill that 30 megahertz has been identified for sale. I wonder if that spectrum has actually been identified, which particular spectrum you're looking at trying to auction. because I think that we're actually sort of in that gray area. We need to do a lot of work and planning. And my second question is, I've been modifying with your discussion of the Spectrum Relocation Fund. We need to do a lot of planning to move out of the L-band for Homeland Defense and Security and weather and FAA is going to require in the order of $15 billion and a lot of planning. And the Spectrum Relocation Fund was not able to allow us to do that. I wondered, is that authorized now? And if so, how soon can you get access to money to get started? Because there's a lot of interest here and concern about DoD and the other agency partners getting caught flat-footed and getting behind the power curve. Thank you.
In terms of the changes to the SRF, the funding will be available to do research and to do work that is approved by the technical panel. So at this point, agencies that want to get started, particularly in the L-band, I think you're right, there are certainly plenty of pieces of spectrum that have been identified in the L-band that are potential candidates. And to go to your first question, has that 30 megahertz been identified? NTIA has identified a number of potential candidate bands, and they've been doing this since all of eternity at this point, it feels like, but certainly since the National Broadband Plan, identifying candidate bands. And we were really hopeful in drafting the budget, Title 10 of the Budget Act, that 30 megahertz isn't what they come up with. We hope they come up with a lot more than that. 30 is what it says in there, and certainly I have no doubt that NTIA and the agencies and OMB and others will meet the target that was set in the legislation, but we're hoping they really exceed the target. As for the money, there is a process set forth in Title 10 that describes how to go about that. It is agencies producing a report up to OMB. OMB submits it to the technical panel, although technically I think the agencies ultimately submit it to the technical panel. And that technical panel will identify whether or not it is a plan that is likely to speed bringing a candidate band to market or not. And there's 4 criteria that are set in there. I'm not going to try and parrot them here. As it turns out, I will massacre that. But you can find them in Title 10 of the Bipartisan Budget Act.
Part of the problem will be that planning to get to that proposal from NTIA, that's sort of the valley of death. Because right now, particularly if you look at Homeland Defense and Security, it's relative priority among DoD with all of the other activities that are going in place. It's very difficult to get the funding together, even to do the planning necessary to put that proposal together to get the Spectrum Relocation Fund funding. I think that might be something that could be a problem.
I appreciate that. I'm certainly, we're willing to look at finding ways to speed things more efficiently. In terms of how it works now, I will obviously defer to my executive branch and independent colleagues that have more experience with the IRAC and sort of the technical panel process.
Okay. Maybe we'll close then with a question, if it works. We'll close with a question about next steps, what will happen in March of 2016, how you think the reverse auction is kind of a cool idea. So what do you think when you think about the effort to finally move some of the broadcasters out of the spectrum they hold, and how do you think that will go? What do you think the future holds? How long will it take?
From my perspective, I'll say we are optimistic and bullish. It is, a fantastic opportunity. And first off, hats off to the FCC. This is an enormously complicated auction, and we won't go into all the details here, but it is enormously complicated. No one's ever tried this before. And David was talking about how folks look to the U.S. and the leadership that we have shown on all number of levels. Part of it is because of great folks at the FCC and their leadership in inventing the auction, or at least implementing the first auction. Congress invented it, I guess. And then folks like Commissioner Rosenworcel, who, as much as anyone is sort of associated with the Spectrum portfolio there. I think there are always challenges, and different carriers in our industry will have different strategies, and it has to do with things not just spectrum related, but overall economy and their capital structure and things like that. But I think the success of the ABS3 auction obviously bodes well. It got a lot of broadcaster interest in it. We won't know until it's there. Folks aren't always eager to share all their strategies publicly. But we're excited and bullish on it. I think it's going to be really interesting. And as I said, kudos to the FCC. They're doing some
And you
really
think the demand is there for the spectrum to open up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would echo what Todd said. Hats off to the FCC team that worked on the auction. I'm not going to pretend that there aren't some concerns my bosses have, and they've been pretty well documented, and they've said them themselves, so I don't feel the need to repeat them. But I think what we're going to see come March is that the success of this auction is going to hinge on the ability of this model that we've put together for the reverse and forward auction to produce as much clean spectrum as possible in a way that provides the bidders on both sides of the equation, both the reverse bidders and the forward bidders, with as much transparency and as much information as they need to make smart economic decisions. And if the FCC makes sure that they're providing that information and that we're producing clean spectrum, I have no doubt that, while it is not exaggeration to say the eyes of the world are upon us, that they're going to see that, again, the United States has taken an auction model that folks were a little skeptical about and made it work.
So I really appreciated the comments about the FCC. I just, from where we started and knowing how complicated this was and how many things we had to tackle.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No. I mean, if I come back in a few years and the mics still work, it'll be safe.
Oh, don't say that. It was so hard to get them to work the first time.
It'll be even better. Speaking for the staff who've worked so hard, and Gary Epstein and Howard Simons, who've led the effort, and with the support of all the bureaus and offices, and all the hard work with Commissioner Rosenworth, the chairman, and all the folks at the commission, all of the commissioners. We're actually at a point now we can see the light for an auction coming. There's still work ahead of us, obviously, but you can look at this and say, it's going to be a tremendous opportunity. We believe that we've done everything possible to make it successful. In talking to broadcasters, we know that there's enormous interest. In talking to the wireless carriers, we know there's enormous interest. So it sure looks like we've got all the ingredients in place for a successful auction.
Great.
And I haven't really been directly involved in the incentive auction at all, except for my role in raising enough money to fund FirstNet and the AWS-3 auction, so that take the pressure off those guys, so they can do real spectrum management and not revenue raising exercise. And so because of the AWS-3 auction that came and the revenues raised from that, it funded all of the programs listed in the 2012 Act all the way down to E911. So everything's already funded, so no pressure now on the revenue side. Now it's just about getting the spectrum reallocated to the highest and best use, using this mechanism, which as a long-time person involved in this, and having seen the auction program evolve from its beginnings in the 90s, it's really incredible to see how they've pulled this thing off.
I do think it might be more fun to watch the auction than to actually try and do it. So, but
I can't figure out the fan duel. I'm not sure I can figure out that.
Well, I was going to say that would be a good moment to transition. I'm not so sure now. But could you join me in thanking our panel, and then we'll. I think you guys can go to the front.